Hello, it's Friday, it's Julia, it's The Leopard in the Golden Cage again, chapter 13 this time. It's the end of the second week of homeschooling for us and maybe for some of you. I wonder what you've been up to. My 8-year-old son has just made a cake, an apple cake, which is in the oven at the moment because we're running a bit low on biscuits. We really need to go to the supermarket. The fridge is empty. The vegetable racks are empty, the fruit bowl is empty, it's all looking a bit empty, but we're putting it off because we don't want to have to queue outside the supermarket. Anyway, so there's a cake in the oven which is going to do us for tea this afternoon. And what else? We've done some drawing. My small son drew a mermaid with fangs. Never knew mermaids had fangs. And these things on the end of its hands, which was obviously supposed to be fingers, but which were sort of lines, like a bit like a rake, one of those garden rakes that's got for raking up grass or leaves. It's got really long things. Look quite evil. But the son of a friend of ours very kindly said it was the coolest mermaid he'd ever seen, and he's 14, so he ought to know. What else have we done? Not much, actually. Quite a bit of maths, quite a bit of English. Some story writing. Small person drew a solar system. So yeah, we've kind of filled our time. They're all outside at the moment, but I'm back in the kitchen, so there's every possibility that I'm going to get photo bombed or video bombed as I read this next chapter to you. Anyway, we've got to chapter 13, so we're a long way through the book now. You may remember that we've just had Salustia's wedding feast. So I've just seen friends just put a comment up saying a very Harry Potter mermaid with Wolverine hands. That is what the fanged mermaid looked like. It was quite Harry Potter, actually. Anyway, so yeah, wedding feast we've had, and the leopard has been let out or has escaped from the cage, and there's been absolute chaos. And during the chaos, the chaos has saved Joe in a way, because the people who are supposed to be Joe's parents are here at the wedding. Severina Orbiana and her husband Marcus Placidius. And of course they won't know Joe at all. So in a way he has been rescued from this potential disaster. Oh dear, we seem to be having some internet problems today. My son said it kept dropping out earlier on when he was watching something or using the internet. Anyway, so yeah, Joe has ended up back in his own world. Okay, in our time. Joe woke the next morning from the deepest sleep he could ever remember. "Come on, lazy bones." Sam booted the end of the sofa bed. "How long have you been up?" Joe mumbled. "Over an hour. We haven't been creeping around either. I can't believe you didn't wake up." Joe drifted through to the bathroom and began to clean his teeth, looking at himself vaguely in the mirror. It was only when he straightened up from rinsing the toothpaste away that he realised that he looked completely normal. It was just as well his hair wasn't still black, but he was sorry he hadn't had the chance to see it. If the experience of having it dyed hadn't been so unpleasant, he would have thought he'd dreamt it. But there was no way his imagination could have conjured that smell. He stood under the hot blast of the shower until Dad hammered on the bathroom door. "Get a move on, Joe. We're going out in 15 minutes. "Where are we going?" Joe asked as he pulled on his clothes and went into the kitchen. "It's Sam's choice today, so it's Laser Quest." "Do we have to?" "Yes, we do," Dad said. "We went to Fishbourne yesterday, didn't we? Even though Sam didn't want to." "I suppose so." Joe helped himself to breakfast. It seemed impossible that was only yesterday. And what would Lucy think of today's activity? Him and Sam leaping around in the dark, shooting each other with beams of light. Her life was so much more real. With a sudden pit in his stomach, he realised he didn't know if he'd survived the leopard and the stampeding guests. She must have done. Oh, sorry, I've misread that. With a sudden pit in his stomach, he realised he didn't know if she'd survived the leopard and the stampeding guests. She must have done, he decided. She couldn't have been killed. That would be too terrible. He put the thought determinedly out of his mind. Laser Quest was fun after all, even though Joe couldn't shrug off the feeling that it was a weird thing to do. In a way, it was helpful too, because there was lots of time when he didn't have to talk to Dad or Sam. It seemed to be much more difficult to adjust to being back in his own world this time, after being away for so much longer. What he really wanted was to get back to Dad's place, to the book Dad had bought him yesterday, so that he could read up about Lucy's father. The minute they got in, he went and fetched it and curled up on the sofa. "If there are any bits you don't understand," Dad said, "just ask." "It's fine." Joe turned to the index. Lucy's father wasn't in there. He frowned. Had the guide been wrong? He turned back to the contents page, and there it was, a whole chapter about him in chapter 3. Joe flicked through to the right place in the book and began to read. After a minute, he frowned again. A lot of the words were long, and they'd been strung together into difficult sentences. He scanned through for bits he could understand more easily. On the 3rd page of the chapter was a paragraph set apart from the rest. "The Emperor Domitian put many senators to death," Joe read, "including Sallustius Lucullus, governor of Britain." "Oh no!" he gasped. He read the rest of the section. There was no mistake. Lucy's father had been killed by the Emperor. "What's the matter?" Dad looked up from his cup of tea. Joe stared at him, unable to think what to say. Lucy's father had been put to death, executed. That was like Dad being executed. In fact, it was like Dad being executed by the Queen. It was ridiculous, but also horrifying. "That man," he muttered, "the one who owned Fishbourne. The Emperor had him killed." "Oh dear, what for?" Dad was completely unconcerned, but of course he would be. He didn't know this man or his family. Joe looked down at the book. Someone invented a new kind of lance, and it was named after him rather than the Emperor. Dad smiled. "That sounds like a trumped-up excuse, doesn't it? You can't imagine that was the real reason." Joe swallowed and put the book down. He had to hide how he felt, or Dad would think he was overreacting. "We're lucky to live when we do," Dad said, sipping his tea. "I've thought that about most periods in history over the years." Joe got up. "I'm hungry," he lied, to change the subject. That night, before he turned out the light, he picked up the book again. Although he was tired, he wanted to know everything he could find out about Lucy's father. But it didn't say where or how Lucullus had been executed, or even what year, only that it had been before AD 96, because that was when the Emperor Domitian had died. Hang on a minute, the phone's ringing. My phone never rings, nobody ever rings us on the house phone. Deary me. This is why it's a very not perfect system, recording these videos. It's because that kind of thing happens. I don't know who that was. It said private caller. I never answer numbers that say private caller. Where was I? Oh yeah. Joe got up. "I'm hungry," he lied, to change the subject. That night, before he turned out the light, he picked up the book again. Although he was tired, he wanted to know everything he could find out about Lucy's father, but it didn't say where or how Lucullus had been executed, or even what year, only that it had been before AD 96, because that was when the Emperor Domitian had died. It was hopeless, Joe thought glumly. He didn't know what year it had been in Lucy's time anyway, and even if he'd asked her, he didn't know if she would be counting it in the same way. dates for the Romans were either BC, which he knew stood for before Christ, or AD, which meant afterwards, except the A wasn't for after. But did Lucy even know about Jesus? She'd never said anything about religion, only about offerings to the household gods. Now that he thought about it, it seemed more than likely that the numbering system was something that historians had come up with later. He put the book down and rolled over to try and sleep. There were just too many problems. As well as the dates, there was the leopard and the stampede and the question of whether Lucy was okay. Then there was the same question as before, about whether he would be able to get back. And even if she was okay and he did get back, there was now also the question of whether to tell her about what he'd found out. If his own dad was going to die in a few years' time, he didn't think he'd want to know, unless there was something he could do to change it. But Lucy wouldn't be able to change it, would she, even if he told her? Because if she did, the present would have to be changed as well. If she found a way to stop the Emperor from executing her father, the book that Dad had bought Jo would have to change so that it didn't say that anymore. And since it was already printed, that had to be impossible. He pulled the duvet up to his chin. Perhaps he shouldn't tell her then. But in that case, he would have to try and act normally, and that would be really difficult, knowing what he knew. She was bound to notice, and if he didn't tell her what it was, or if he tried to lie, she would guess he was hiding something and get upset. He groaned, his brain hurt. The last couple of days with Dad passed pleasantly enough. Jo knew that he should be sad that their week together was coming to an end, but he was so preoccupied that he didn't think about it very much. It was when he was unpacking his things back at home again that it really hit him. This was how it was going to be from now on. Never any normal time with Mum and Dad together, and only bits of time at weekends and holidays with Dad. He felt as though he'd wasted a lot of the last week, first wondering whether he would be able to get back into Lucy's time, and then worrying about her. It was stupid, he thought crossly. None of the stuff about Lucy mattered while he was still here in his own world. So for the next few days, he tried not to think about her quite as much. In any event, he told himself, if she was right, and he'd been pulled into her world when she touched his St. Christopher, it was really up to her when she called him back. He could think about her all day long, but she was probably asleep for half the time, and even when they were both awake at the same time, she wouldn't ever touch the St. Christopher if there was anyone else nearby. On top of that, she had her own life, so she probably wasn't thinking about him all that often anyway. He had to get on with other things and stop mooning around like he was waiting for her to call. The question, though, was what to do. Mum had been extra nice since he and Sam got back and kept asking if they wanted to invite friends round to play. "I thought you might like to have people here," she said, "since I guess you went out a lot with Dad." It was another one of her questions that was pretending not to be a question, Jo thought. Like everything else she'd said about the time they'd spent with Dad. It reminded him of someone poking a bear with a stick. She sort of jabbed at the subject, jumping back each time. He couldn't work out whether she actually wanted to know what they'd done with Dad or not. Sam invited Ben round straight away, but Jo refused. In spite of his efforts not to think about Lucy, she was the only person he wanted to see. He didn't know what he would talk to any of his other friends about. The third time Mum asked, however, he said yes, to please her and to distract himself. But it was just as he'd feared. His friend Matthew joked around all afternoon in a way that seemed childish to Jo, and they couldn't agree on anything to do together except for kicking a ball around the garden. After Matthew had gone, Jo overheard Mum talking to Kate on the phone. "I'm really worried about him," she was saying. He seems really badly affected by the separation, especially after staying with Steve for the week. It isn't that, Joe wanted to shout from the top of the stairs. I just want to be somewhere else. The Roman obsession seems to have passed, though, said his mum. He took his books back to the library and didn't borrow any others. Perhaps Steve bored him out of it. She laughed. He did buy him a really heavy book about Roman Sussex, not suitable for a 10-year-old at all. It isn't an obsession, Joe shouted silently, and it hasn't passed. Dad's book was really useful. I took the other books back because there's nothing new in them now I've seen it all with my own eyes. He stomped into his room and banged the door. She would never understand. He threw himself down on his bed. He knew he was being unfair. How could she understand when he couldn't tell her any of it? But he wasn't in the mood to be fair. Come on, Lucy, he said out loud. Call me, please. Nothing happened. He drummed on his pillow with his fists. Come on! But for 3 more weeks, still nothing happened. Joe grew more and more irritable. Perhaps the adventure was over. Perhaps he would never go back to Lucy's time again. But he had such a strong feeling of unfinished business. He couldn't bear for this to be the end. It was the last evening before he went back to school that it finally happened. He was standing in his room, looking at his uniform laid out on his bed, thinking about his lessons with Petrus, and wondering how Lucy and her brother were doing. And in the next moment he had the same feeling he'd had before, of the world moving around him. There was the hissing sound, and suddenly he was in darkness. He put out his hands and touched something slightly rough. He seemed to be wrapped in a column of material. Lucy had pushed him behind a curtain in the banqueting hall as he disappeared, so perhaps he'd reappeared in the same spot. It would be useful if that always happened, he thought. He felt around until he found the edge of the curtain. All sound inside it was muffled, but he didn't think there was anybody on the other side. He wondered how much time had passed since he was last here. Cautiously he drew back the curtain and stepped out. Shafts of moonlight fell across the tiled floor from each of the high windows. The hall was otherwise in darkness. Joe looked around. There was nobody here and no sign of the feast. He glanced down at himself. He was wearing Roman clothes as usual. Beside the curtain was a door. He tried it. It was locked. Further along the same wall was another door. The hall echoed with his footsteps. The second door was also locked. He looked around again. The main entrance to the hall was closed off with a screen. Still, that seemed the most likely way out. He tiptoed across to it, looking over his shoulder every other second. But there was definitely nobody here to see him. At one side of the screen there was a gap. Joe squeezed through it. Outside, the formal gardens were bathed in moonlight so bright it was almost like day. The trees in the middle of each section of lawn cast sharp black shapes across the grass, and the floors of the colonnades were striped by the shadows of the pillars that held them up. He wished he knew what time it was. It felt like the middle of the night, but it could be the early darkness of a winter evening. It was certainly much colder than when he was last here. The thing to do was find Lucy. She must have been thinking of him to call him into her time, so even if it was the middle of the night, she must be awake. Walking as smoothly and quietly as he could, he went down the east colonnade and along the south wing. The door to the servant rooms on the end of the building was closed. He went around to the side with the terraces. There were no candles lit in the courtyard, no light visible in the rooms behind. He crept through the courtyard nearest to Lucy's room and felt his way along the passage till he reached it. Gently, he tapped on the door. There was no answer. He pushed it open and tiptoed in. His eyes had got used to the darkness as he crept along the passage, but still he rubbed them to try and see better. Lucy's bed stood in front of him. The covers were drawn up over it. "Lucy," he whispered. He bent down and patted it with his hands, not wanting to believe what his eyes were telling him. The bed was empty. Lucy was not there. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 13. 3 more chapters to go. 3 more chapters to go. Which, as you would know, if you ever try and write a story or have been shown a story mountain, that's something that where the climax begins to build before the resolution and the end. I don't know if you noticed how many people walked through the room during that session, quite apart from the phone ringing. My husband walked in, then my middle son walked in, then my eldest son walked in. The only son who didn't walk in is the small one, who would have been much less disciplined about not coming and gurning into the phone. The trouble with having to stay at home is that my kids have started having some of their music lessons over Zoom online, and they, particularly the little one, but also the middle one, cannot resist spending all their time going at the phone. It's terrible trying to get them to concentrate on what the teacher's saying because they're too busy looking at themselves. Anyway, so another chapter probably Monday, 2 o'clock Monday. So we've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday before we come to the next book if we decide we're going to go on. I've also put these up onto YouTube if you prefer to look at things on YouTube, so you'll find them there. I'm going to put a link to from my website there as well. The website, I haven't got the thing written down, which says www.scargatherer.co.uk, Scargatherer being the name of the series. So there we are, and I'll see you. Have a nice weekend. Don't eat any chocolate because remember it's Easter next weekend. We haven't got any Easter eggs yet, along with no milk and almost no cheese and no tomatoes and no fruit and no vegetables. We need to go shopping. Maybe we'll do that later today. Have a nice weekend and I'll see you next week.